be screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the fourth part of, What If Issei, Rias enter Beelzebub. Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of WD0345 on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Fiorucci ducked under a harsh strike, springing up to his feet to block a straight jab for his chin. Rolling with the blow, he twisted on his hands and tried to kick his opponent in the gut. Kirin had expected it and blocked it with his tonfa, bringing his leg up to counterattack and landing a hit square on Fiorucci's head. He blinked his eyes as his head snapped back, trying his best to stem the onslaught of bleariness as he spun his tonfas in his hands to block 3 more strikes aimed for his vitals. The 2 pillars disengaged, Fiorucci stumbling backwards while Kirin merely jumped, and took a small breather as they waited for another chance to strike. Fiorucci panted as he stared at Kirin. The older male didn't seem winded or otherwise harmed from their bout, while Fiorucci sported several new bruises and cuts on his body. The pillar had told Fiorucci that throughout their time training with one another, or really it should be called physical whaling, that he would not go easy on him. It was one thing to be told it, and a completely other thing to have it being done to you. Fiorucci blocked the second shot, twisted around, and ducked underneath Kirin's outstretched hand. He swiped his hand right, aiming to elbow the older pillar's gut, but his attempt was blocked and was countered with a high kick to his head. Fiorucci stumbled back, dazed, and didn't manage to parry the next hit in time. He hit the ground with a thud, and was able to roll back onto his feet. He blinked back the dizziness and refocused his eyes onto a grinning Kirin who stood there with a wide smirk on his lips. His stance was wide open, mockingly so, and the way he swung his arms showed restlessness that bordered laziness. It was an insult directed straight at him, and one Fiorucci was only able to recognize due to the burning rage that overtook his soul as the vampire side started demanding for BLD. Fiorucci resisted the urge as the calmer parts of his soul started to temper the raging fire. He clicked his tongue and repositioned his legs. False experience and knowledge filtered through his mind, and he tried his best to focus solely on that part of his soul. Strangely, Fiorucci thought about how he had never felt something like this before. He had been mostly ignorant as to how a soul would feel like, but as of now, since his soul was now an eldritch abomination, Fiorucci became acutely aware as to how a soul felt like. He played host to a variety of types after all, and was thus now foreign in his own body as his original soul collided with these different brands, each bearing different staples and stereotypes of their kind. He could blame his ignorance on the subject of souls till recently, but Fiorucci had slightly marveled at how bright his human soul was and consequently how the more supernatural parts contrasted darkly against his original soul. He felt Kirin's peace on his soul begin to spread and reach across his body. The tonfa in his hands was gripped tighter, and he felt himself form the stance that Kirin had taught him. It was imperfect, a sham, and even though Fiorucci was trying his hardest to emulate the secrets that Kirin's soul tried to feed him, he couldn't quite get it down right. But it was enough, and that was all that mattered. He reacted, striding forward and pushing his tonfa into a straight jab. Kirin slapped it away and Fiorucci rolled with it to build momentum in his other hand. The demon parried the second hit, and then another, and then another. Each time Kirin blocked one hand, another came to hit him on the other side. The demon grunted, and using both hands he knocked Fiorucci back. The white-haired lieutenant brought his right leg back to stop himself from stumbling backward and tried to knee Kirin in between the legs. It was blocked and Fiorucci hopped back to prepare another tactic. He focused harder on Kirin's soul, stretching it across his own and trying to force it to unlock the proper movements, stances, and tactics to him. For a moment it worked, his stance shifted slightly, small movements that could go unnoticed, but they were there. Then Kirin's soul was beat back by the vampire as it surged against its natural enemy, while the water spirit and the yokai inside him tried to quell the sudden civil war before it attracted the dryad and the fae. Fiorucci dropped his tonfas at the sudden war, his body twitching in silent pain as Kirin's little slice of soul was beaten back with such fervent ferocity. He was unable to react to Kirin clotheslining him into the ground, and was forced to concede defeat as the wind rushed out of his lungs. Lost control again? Kirin asked calmly. His answer was a gurgle of noises as Fiorucci grabbed his stomach. Kirin made a sigh and gestured for Aleem, who was chewing on a lollipop in a corner, to heal Kirin. Mao, this is the third time today. You're tiring me out, Furikin. Aleem complained. Even in his state of dreariness, Fiorucci was still very impressive in his vocal skills. Don't say stuff like that. That was a pretty weak Tsukomi, Kirin commented. Bite me, I'm panting on the floor curled up into a ball, Fiorucci huffed. Kirin raised an eyebrow at him, and the young teenager didn't even need a second to know what he had done. I regret everything. Geez, stay still and stop crying. Aleem waved her wand, which Fiorucci knew to be ridiculous since she really didn't need a wand, and cast a healing spell over his body. It boosted his slightly higher healing rate thanks to the water spirit inside him, and sealed most of his injuries before they became life-threatening. Feeling his body return to its proper state, as a teenage boy should be in, Fiorucci rose to his full height and pulled his jacket over his body. His body felt colder than usual, another side effect of having a vampire soul strapped inside him, and his human body sadly made the feeling very uncomfortable. I don't know how to get around the problem, Fiorucci admitted as he pulled his jacket even tighter around him. No matter how much I pull on your experience and your knowledge, the rest of my body horribly rejects it. Learning the stance and the forms doesn't even change anything, it pulls on the soul just as much as I would have trying to do it myself, and my body would reject it again. This is so frustrating. It really was. No matter how much Fiorucci tried, his own soul seemed to be making things difficult for him. You'll find a way around it, Kirin said, fixing his tonfas onto his back. You just need time. Fiorucci smiled weakly and fixed his uniform as Aleem started preparing the next part of his lessons. The magic, which Fiorucci called freaky occult math, was just as terrible as the physical abuse. Alright, where were we? Aleem pulled out a large book, which was ripped and looked worn with use, and started flipping through the pages with reading glasses on her face. You already know the theory with most of the summoning magic, I thought you, but because of how unique your contract is, I think it's best for you to learn some teleportation magic too. First, recite to me the basic summoning magic and the formula. Save me. Kirin smirked but otherwise did nothing of the sort for Fiorucci. Whining pitifully, Fiorucci resigned himself to the mental abuse that he would suffer in the place of the tiny witch. Before anything else could be mentioned, however, there was a soft knocking on the door. The gathered people all turned to the source, and were only partially surprised to see Lamia there with a small frown on her face. Geez, I was looking everywhere for you guys, she said as she strode into the room. Kirin shrugged his shoulder unapologetically as he stared at her. I wrote a memo, he said indifferently. Where? Lamia replied exasperatedly. Kirin reached into his pocket and pulled out a yellow sticky note before handing it to Lamia. There, Kirin said nonchalantly, I just forgot to put it in a place for you to find, but better late than never. Fiorucci became concerned as a tic formed on Lamia's forehead, both for Kirin and Lamia if she managed to go through with it. Ugh, never mind. How long have you guys been here? She asked as she walked up to Fiorucci. He chuckled awkwardly as she pushed him into a seat and started running tests on his body. I skipped most of the first few classes, and took the middle 2 periods as a break, so I'd say for at least 3 hours, he admitted freely. Why, is there a problem? It was after school now anyway. Of course there is. Lamia said irritably, we're still unsure of the limits to your body, and overstressing it like this could lead to unforeseen side effects. Fiorucci laughed sheepishly as he scratched the back of his neck. The little pinkette assumed lecturing position number 2, with her hands on her hips and her legs spread apart. Listen here Fiorucci. You're not as dumb as Oga, so you don't have an excuse for being so beat up and disregarding your own health. Don't go trying to get yourself killed for the stupid excuse of getting stronger. Of course not. I'm not the main hero of some eki, shounen anime. Fiorucci yelled. Lamia seemed to sag in relief at that, her worries sated for now, but didn't let go of her harsh demeanor. What about your plans for the Mao's arrival? Have you figured that out? For some reason or another, Lamia had been quizzing him on basic tactics and planning. Qualities of an officer, she said, and while he felt grateful for her concern, he had to wonder why now of all times did she express it so willingly. Kirin will shadow the Mao's, while I shadow the Gremory group. Leviathan Sama had personally sent a message to Behemoth that she would handle Citri-san's group, and Eileen will be monitoring the situation from the sky, Fiorucci said, a repetition of the many other times he had recited it that day alone with Kirin. During class time, Kirin and I will split up and patrol around the buildings for any traps or the like. Lamia bit the side of her lip as she crossed her arm, her eyes closed in thought. Fiorucci glanced at Kirin, but the experienced pillar didn't seem to mind her actions, so Fiorucci chose to ignore it as well. The Mao's will be here tomorrow for the visit, are your parents coming Fiorucci? Lamia asked. Yeah they will, but I doubt they'd come to see me. They'll probably just come to watch Anoka, Fiorucci muttered. He slipped his arms into his jacket and clipped the buttons into place. His jacket wrapped snugly around his newly acquired muscles, and the lieutenant was still slightly uncomfortable with the sudden bulk. He shook the feeling away and looked at Anoka, who seemed to be blushing for some reason. Are you okay? He asked. Of course I am, she said quickly. Here, mother asked me to give you this. With speed that Fiorucci didn't know she had, Lamia pushed a pin to his chest and disappeared out the door. Blinking in surprise, Fiorucci glanced down at the pin that she had given him. It was of a dagger that resembled a tanto in its sheath, with a snake coiled around it. The head of the snake rested at the top of the hilt and it was entirely colored a dull gold. That's the pin of the Serpent Guards. It denotes members of the Pillar Squad who act as aides or elite members that serve under the Pillar Barons directly. The Pillar's generals have some commandment over them too, however their rank is technically equal, though the generals are senior officers. I too am a Serpent Guard under Jabberwock, Kirin said as he noted the unique design. She giving this to you means that she probably convinced her mother on your abilities and potential. Why would she do that? Fiorucci asked, befuddled. Kirin only looked at Fiorucci blankly for a moment, sighing as his opinions were cemented. I can understand it perfectly fine, since she has her own position as Lamia's daughter to worry about. Even though she is an apprentice to the blackjack, it is not enough. You'll need to climb the social ladder as well if all her strong work would not be for naught. I don't mind climbing up the hierarchy, it's just I didn't expect her to be so enthusiastic about it for me, Fiorucci muttered. With a shrug he clipped the pin on his left side, and ran his hand over his sleeve to smooth the edges. Geez, for someone who's a mob character you really are clueless sometimes. Eileen said in exasperation. A knocking on the door drew their attention again, and Fiorucci was further surprised to find Zenobia there. Remembering his earlier conversation with her, Fiorucci couldn't help but blush happily as he approached her with a goofy smile. Zenobia noticed the two others in the room as she confidently strode into the room. Did I interrupt a meeting between you and your superiors? I apologize if so. Always so blunt, like a true knight. It was a refreshing atmosphere to be in. Not at all, Kirin said, we were wrapping up actually. Eh? But I haven't given my lesson yet. Eileen exclaimed. She stomped her foot on the ground grumpily as she bit her lip. What's the point of getting a doctorate if I'm not gonna use it? Furuichi was a little surprised at that. No. Is it right for a little girl like her to so nonchalantly declare that she had a doctorate? There were people in their early 30s who still worked strong for that recognition. This was beyond the level of ridiculousness. Furuichi would have said something had Zenovia not pulled on his sleeve. Regardless, I come bearing a message from Sonakaishu. With regards to the planned meeting with the mouse, she asks that the pillars assist the student council by checking the area of the town for any signs of magical interference or the type. The student council will prioritize sweeping the school. Checking the town. Indeed, that would be the task most suited for the unrelated pillars to be assigned. But Zenovia hadn't let go of her sleeve, and instead looked up at Furuichi with a fire in her eyes. Also, I would like to spend some time with Takayuki. I was informed that a date at the starting stages of a courtship is too heavy-handed, so I would request that Takayuki SERT me home. T. Takayuki. Furuichi spluttered, grabbing his throat in embarrassment at having a appealing girl so confidently say his name like that. Aleem, who had stepped up to stand next to Kirin, had her hand up against her mouth and an excited blush dusting her cheeks. Her eyes gained a starry light as she appreciated the drama in front of her. Kirin seemed completely nonplussed. Is it wrong? Zenovia asked, her face still the determined mask she had on when she walked in. As I have decided that I would strive to become your lover, such shows of affection would be common. Perhaps a nickname? Taka? Furu-san. But that's pretty silly. I think you broke him, Aleem commented idly as she stared at the dumbstruck face of Furuichi. In all seriousness, Furuichi was the happiest he had been in a long time. In fact, you could say he is the happiest man alive at the moment. And no, I'm fine, Furuichi quickly amended. Though Furuichi was still unsure to the use of his name, in some ways, it was just too much, but it was also amazingly refreshing. Just surprised is all. Zenovia nodded in resolution and then pulled Furuichi out of the room. Then let us head home together, she said. No, exalted would be a better word. Aleem had said something behind their backs, but Furuichi was too busy memorizing the soft feel of Zenovia's hands to notice. The loitering students on school grounds staying back for club meetings were given the treat to see the school's newest Bishujo drag the military school transfer student out of the old school building by his hand, and both Motohama and Matsuda were crying as they watched the not-so-handsome student be dragged away. At once, they both decided to shave their heads and join the military. Of course, they were not the main characters of the story, so in all honesty, you shouldn't be giving a SHT about them. Oh, Furuichi said, stopping Zenovia at the gate of the school. Where exactly do you live, Zenovia? Is it somewhere nearby my house? Furuichi asked. Zenovia paused, cupping her chin as she thought about it. Actually, I'm living in the old school building for the time being, Zenovia admitted. Then you live in the school. How in any way is this okay? Rather than that, where am I supposed to SCRT you to? Zenovia huffed as she placed her hands on her hips. It leaves us with no choice. I'll simply follow you to your house, since I live in school, she said, as though it was perfectly normal. Furuichi's sweat dropped at her assured expression. Wait a minute, are you escorting me? Furuichi asked. For the sake of romance, we have to reach a compromise, she stated evenly. The sweat drop grew bigger, but even then, there was something to be appreciated in Zenovia's straightforwardness and calm logic. Well, even if it does take away the moment. By the way, why are we waiting by the gate? Oh, right, Furuichi chuckled awkwardly, sorry, you'll have to accommodate for an extra. My little sister goes to Kuo too, so we'll be walking home with her, he stated. Zenovia seemed surprised by that, as she looked up at him with wide eyes. You have a sister? She asked, almost in a whisper. Is she a member of the Pillars as well? He shook his head in the negative. No, she's a normal human being. She's completely unrelated to the supernatural world. Whatever surprise Zenobia had at him having a sister was only increased when she heard that. Don't tell me you've somehow managed to keep your status as a contract holder a secret from your family, she said. Surely they must have seen the signs, or you would have to have explained some of it. Fiorucci scratched his head, idly wondering what the big deal was. Oga was able to hide his contract with Beelzebub, and it was with one of the Mao's kid to boot. He didn't really think his contracts compared to that. Being a contract holder wasn't something I expected to happen. It just did, and I had to familiarize myself with using it quickly, so I guess I just didn't have the time. Though I don't quite understand why I should tell them anything at all. Zenobia quietly mulled over his words, a curious glint in her eyes. No, it's all right. It's just most contract holders are solitary people, ranging from magicians to outcasts. They would usually be people with the desires to want something stronger than any other human being. It's not like the contracts we hand out on our flyers. Contracts like these should be more personal and be so demanding so as to allow the contractor to successfully bind the devil in the agreement. And you say you had contracted with all of the pillars too? She grabbed her chin, her eyes narrowed in deep thought, as she bore a hole into Fiorucci's head. Fiorucci blushed and stuttered at the attention he was getting, turned away in embarrassment. Zenobia seemed to caught on to something as she asked, "You said you had to familiarize yourself with your contract, why?" Fiorucci blinked and his response was almost immediate, "Oga needed me." "Oga?" "Sorry, a friend needed my help," he clarified, not that it was much help, he added as a bitter afterthought. No more words could be exchanged, though Fiorucci did note something lighting up in Zenovia's eyes, and both the 2 second years had turned in surprise when a shocked presence had entered their bubble. "Nni-san. Who is this?" Anoka asked, her mouth ajar in shock as she stared at the appealing knight in front of her. Oh Anoka, this is Zenobia, she's my CLA-. "I am Takayuki's lover," Zenobia interjected. "Takayuki?" Anoka spluttered. Fiorucci sweat dropped, hoping that he could somehow salvage the situation. "It's not like that," he tried to amend quickly, "she's just joking around." "Not at all, I fully intend to have Takayuki be the father to my children," Zenobia stated. At that point both Fiorucci and Anoka were on the verge of fainting, one from shock while the other from all the shocking news throughout the day. "Ho Anoka, let's just head home and talk about this there, all right?" His sister could only nod dumbly, and Fiorucci felt slightly bad at all the things he was putting her through. They walked silently down the way back to their apartment, or the Fiorucci's apartment at least. Anoka was still stunned at the new revelation, while Fiorucci felt incredibly awkward. Zenobia seemed unaffected, in fact she was currently leaning her head on his shoulder, smiling slightly as she snuggled her cheeks against him. It felt great. The fact his RGHT arm was in between her boobs was an added bonus. He was in absolute contentment. If it weren't for the whistling sound of a blade heading towards him. The sound of skin being pierced, blood spilling, and a scream filled the air. Anoka screamed, her eyes wide in shock as she stared at her brother's arm, where a silver dagger was currently impaled on. The guard and pommel was made to resemble a cross and there was some smoke being emitted from the wound. Her brother hissed something, and she was worried that maybe the dagger might be burning him, how it was doing that she didn't know, and reached out to try and help him. But to her surprise he merely pulled the blade out of his left arm, which was fake, but she didn't know that, and looked out into the distance, searching for his attacker. Seeing her brother not screaming in pain had surprised Anoka, but that paled in comparison to how she was feeling now that she got a good look at her brother. He had the knife in a reverse hand grip, eyes staring defiantly at wherever he was looking, and his injured left arm was hanging by his side, not even a flinch to show for the new wound. This was utterly wrong, her mind screamed. Her brother would not have pulled a knife out of his arm without even flinching. He would not have assumed a slightly hunched position, keeping the knife at hip level, and looked prepared to fight someone. Her brother would have started screaming, flailing his hands as he would yell and scream in absurdity, but never would he appear as calm as he was now. Anoka, Furuichi muttered, and his voice was deceptively calm for a person who had his arm impaled by a knife. No wait. That's not right at all. A person shouldn't be able to so calm about having his arm impaled. At the very least a normal person, no, even a not normal person would be flinch at having their arm impaled. Look away and close your eyes. Zenobia will take you someplace safe, her brother stated. Takayuki, Zenobia muttered, gripping Furuichi's shoulder as she frowned in grim concentration. Anoka felt like the odd one out, where she was the only one behaving like a normal person would after being attacked. What should we do? Her brother, however, only gave Zenobia a small, though she couldn't help but think it was meaningful, glance. Then his eyes turned towards her, his eyebrows slanted just enough to show he was angry and determined. Anoka, Furuichi muttered, you should hurry home right away, there's no telling what might happen now. The way he said that, his voice strong and labored, and knife glinting in his grasp froze Anoka. She stared at him, and for a moment the images surrounding him flickered. The streetway disappeared to show a warehouse, and her brother's eyes turned dark black. Then it vanished, and the only thing that Anoka felt was the intense wrongness that radiated off her brother. An ice-cold atmosphere, rimmed by fiery anger, and topped with cool spirit seemed to wash over her as her brother emitted something. Zenobia will escort you home, okay? Furuichi said, I'll go get the authorities to make sure these tricksters don't get away. But Anoka was cut off as Zenobia placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a small placating smile on her face. Your Nissan is very strong, Anoka, you don't have to worry, Zenobia said. The youngest Furuichi couldn't believe that, as she was in the opinion that her brother was Oga's lackey and thus, expendable as a useless side character. But before she could voice her opinions, Zenobia spoke up again, staring at her brother's back. Are you sure you don't want me to help you? Her brother shook his head. Keep Anoka safe, she's mom and dad's pride and joy. Zenobia nodded her head and tightened her grip on Anoka's shoulder. Before you leave, Zenobia. This knife belongs to your old profession, doesn't it? Anoka glanced at the dagger that Furuichi raised up, and she realized that it was designed in the shape of a cross with the end of it sharpened to a fine point. Maybe, Zenobia said, but it's not the usual equipment. It could be an independent person following in our footsteps. All right then, Furuichi said with a nod. Take Anoka home, it's a few blocks from here. I, on the other hand, will call the authorities. Roger, Zenobia replied. At that moment, Anoka couldn't help but compare the two of them as soldiers in an active war zone. The way they moved didn't seem like how normal people would, and there was something soldier-like in their gaze. Come along, Anoka-san, we must make haste to your house. But we can't just dash. Again she was interrupted as her brother placed a hand on her head and gently pushed it back. I'll be fine, Anoka. I've survived worse with Oga. She didn't get to say a reply as Zenobia pulled on her sleeve and forced her away. She blinked as she stared back at her brother, but he didn't even glance at her. Instead she caught glimpse of his back, straight, imposing, and unyielding. Whoever you are, the others have left, Furuichi said quietly, knowing whoever was out there could more than likely hear him. While he talked, he prepared the formula that Elim had taught him and focused on it as strong as he could while channeling energy throughout his body. Come out now. That trick with the knife won't affect me at all. You're better off facing me in person. The knife, while not a light sword, was still painful for him. His arm being fake meant he felt nothing, but the vampire soul in him was sent into a howling mess at the religious symbol. It seemed to claw its way to the other side of Furuichi's soul before the water spirit could properly isolate the holy energy that would have been harmless to normal human beings, well, besides having a sharp pointy object inside you. Furuichi gripped his sides, and for a moment he thought he could hear a faint annoyed yelling but shook that thought away as the person he had been eyeing appeared out of the bushes. Sorry about that, but I was curious if that would work. Never fought against a devil contractor before, the newcomer, a man, said. He was dressed in a casual overcoat, a black suit underneath, and an expressionless face marred by stubble. Of course, new experiences aren't bad things. "Who are you?" Fiorucci asked. While he did that, he mentally tweaked the formula in his mind and pulled a little bit more power from the king's crest. "And what are you doing here?" The man tilted his head, and laughed. "I'll give you your time to do what you need," he said, but it didn't reassure Fiorucci at all. "My name is Pierre Everhart, I am an associate of the Chaos Brigade, specifically the Rogue Mage faction." "Chaos Brigade?" Fiorucci asked, but didn't say anything more as he readied his stance. "They're the enemies that have been operating here lately," Hecadoth, the pillar he had summoned, said as he crossed his arms. "They're a terrorist group that's been trying to upset the balance of the underworld ever since the end of the Civil War." "Well, not my faction, the Chaos Brigade only came into being recently," Pierre explained. "I am just a neutral party hired by one faction. A fundamental aspect of the Chaos Brigade you must understand, is that each faction has their own goals and principles." "You can see Hecadoth?" Fiorucci asked, partially astonished. "I am a magician after all. We make pacts with devils to further our research, so it is only natural we can see through any or most forms of summoning. Though, I'm not the scientific type." "What do you want with the lieutenant then?" Hecadoth asked. "It's not me that wants anything from him," Pierre replied. "My employers, however, are a different story. You're a troublesome player all by yourself, disregarding the fact that the current Maos have several already troublesome sacred gears with them. Not to mention, you're a contractor that is currently within the King's Crest system. Add to that your abnormal balance breaker, and it was more than obvious that you'd garner their attention." He shrugged his shoulder. "Me though, I'm just in it for the pay. I've long since dropped my robes for more practical ventures." "Like mercenary work?" Hecadoth asked. "You could say that," Pierre laughed, "though a mercenary wouldn't really step out if asked by his enemy, unless he has an ulterior motive." "What are you trying to say?" Fiorucci asked, staring at him intensely. His body fell onto his stance that Kirin had taught him, and he was prepared to allow Hecadoth's power to surge through him. "Whatever it is you think I'm trying to say," the man shrugged, "it isn't up to me after all." Suddenly, he leapt backwards, pulling two pistols out from behind his back and firing at Fiorucci. The lieutenant blanched and dropped to the ground to avoid the incoming bullets, and as they whizzed by, he realized that they were on fire. "Casting spells on flying objects like that, this guy has some kill," Hecadoth admitted. Fiorucci twisted and dodged another bullet aimed for his head, immensely thankful for his new physique and pillaged skills. "Fiorucci, let me in." "Your body." Fiorucci acknowledged the command with a sweat drop and a sigh of exasperation as Hecadoth entered his body. Immediately he felt the new parts of his soul shift and react to the sudden entry, with the most violent being the vampire, surprise, and a yokai. For a moment Fiorucci thought that Hecadoth would be ejected, but then he heard a voice in his mind. "Collating saved data. Data established. Activating sub-protocol. Converting." This time, rather than having Hecadoth get disassembled and merged into Fiorucci's body, he instead shined bright, and began filling out Fiorucci's body as he normally would. The other parts of his body stilled, and to his astonishment, the different supernatural creatures inside him shined brightly, trying to mimic a human soul. While it was paltry in comparison, it was enough to allow Hecadoth to inhabit Fiorucci's body without trouble. "That was interesting," Fiorucci muttered in confusion. Another trio of bangs and he was forced to jump and land onto a nearby wall as the dangerous flame bullets impacted the ground on the other side of the road. "I can feel some resistance in my body, but it's certainly less than I would have originally thought." "Oh. Have you gotten serious already?" Pierre asked, staring at him. Good, I can't collect good data otherwise." He leapt forward, arms reaching behind him, and palmed two daggers in his hand. He tossed them at Fiorucci, who dodged one and slapped the other one away. He hissed when his skin burned with the contact, and he glanced down at his palm that was smoking. That dagger is doused with holy water, and while it doesn't affect you as a human, when you have a demon inside you and supplying you power, its effectiveness rises. A sound and tactical mind, Fiorucci commentated. All I did was throw a knife. Yet had I dodged to the left, then I would have activated a trap that would blow my entire bottom leg up, Fiorucci commented, motioning his head towards the elaborate magical trap drawn across the side of the wall. This was why Hecadoth suited Fiorucci the most, as playing in tune to the fact that Fiorucci couldn't tank like how Oga or the other demons could. Hecadoth played most battles smart and tight, keeping his cards close to his chest and studying his opponent. Pierre seemed to smirk, his eyes gleaming in the night. You certainly live up to your reputation. A rampaging brute, a sarcastic technique user, and a calm-minded strategist. Truly a man with 100 faces. Fiorucci frowned, and narrowed dangerously slit eyes as he stared at the man. How do you know that title? I asked around, Pierre said cryptically. You'd be surprised at the information you can gather. Surprising indeed, Fiorucci replied. Pierre smiled and then bowed to him. Now, I'm sure you and I have more to analyze from each other. Would you like the first punch or should I? He asked. Fiorucci tilted his head, and then nodded it at Pierre. Me first then. With surprising exuberance, Pierre launched himself at Fiorucci with reckless abandon. Fiorucci dodged the attack, but to his surprise it turned into a mirage, dispersing with a brief show of magic, and Pierre was instead above him, poised with another blade. Fiorucci pulled his tonfa out of his sleeve, but his knowledge and experience that he would usually gain from Kirin's soul was absent, and instead he was forced to defend the attack with what he had learned from Kirin on his so far week-long training. He parried the strike with some difficulty, barely avoiding a graze on his cheek, and steadied himself on the other side of the wall as Pierre landed gracefully opposite him, coat fluttering in the wind. Neat trick. Not many magicians are so cunning, Fiorucci complimented. I'm a dime a dozen, not many can boast my skills, Pierre replied and surged forward with his dagger. Another strike and Fiorucci parried it with his tonfa. With the training Kirin had given him, Fiorucci's body was almost capable of holding of all the strikes, keyword being almost. Pierre twisted the knife in his grasp, and had easily disarmed Fiorucci. In response, he dropped his remaining tonfa and slammed his shoulder into Pierre's gut. The man rocked backwards, and Fiorucci's remaining arm shot forward and landed 3 consecutive blows to his abdomen. Hecadoth's style of fighting mirrored Fiorucci's life with Oga up till that point. Fiorucci had always had the soundest mind on how to get out of a situation, mostly being the fights Oga usually gets involved would lead to his brutal demise. Fiorucci thinks, and through thinking, he escapes. Hecadoth provided that same opportunity, however. Hecadoth thinks to eliminate his opponent in the most decisive way possible. That was why the two were so good together. It combines the efficiency of Hecadoth's fighting style, with the speed and sane logic of Fiorucci. So in disorienting Pierre with the strikes to his stomach, the would-be assassin was unable to defend Fiorucci kicking his knee, breaking the bone. Fiorucci would have cringed in slight discomfort, but Hecadoth continued to surge power through Fiorucci, giving his blows more force and seeking release. The neck hit landed on Pierre's right shoulder, dislocating the arm, and Fiorucci grabbed Pierre and tossed him into the ground head first. Fiorucci spun in place, hands raised level with his face. Would you like to go on? That was a rhetorical question. Fiorucci aimed at the area that would quickly immobilize Pierre and cause the most sudden and greatest amount of pain to dissuade him from continuing the fight. It was a way of fighting only capable when Fiorucci was paired with Hecadoth. 2 distinctly different mindsets of battle, aiming for one goal, to escape the battle as quickly as possible. Through running or victory, either way counts. On the contrary. Pierre said, spitting out BLD, you've done me a great service. I would have liked to garner more data, but I was lucky that you chose to spare me now if this is the minimum of your abilities. A large magic circle appeared underneath Fiorucci, and the lieutenant tried to jump out when it lit up in his face. He twisted his foot, and while he could have merely punched his way out, that would have required too much demonic energy and time, so Fiorucci used the logical part of his brain. He broke the circle by overflowing it with demonic energy. Unlike demon magic, which was powered by creation and imagination, human magic was powered by logic and understanding. Demon magic, that which cannot be understood and applies with it no laws but one's own self, and human magic, that which is governed by a system of cause and effect, are naturally opposite of each other. While human magic and demon magic are compatible, considering it was man's attempt at harnessing demonic energy, one cannot exist within the same medium as the other. They're too different, even if their effects are the same. Thus, the magic circle broke when Fiorucci seeped his demonic energy into the line. Normal magicians or demons would never think of this, as disrupting a magical circle in that way was unheard of. Mad, if one wasn't so eloquent. Fiorucci was able to do it, for the simple fact that Fiorucci lived his life like how no other mortal had. As comic relief, the magic circle exploded, slamming into Fiorucci's face like a jackhammer on steroids, and forced him into the sky. He tried to twist around to land on his feet, but the soles of his boots skidded the ground and instead he landed on the ground, ball first. Ag! He screamed, clutching his jewels as crumpled to the ground. Meanwhile, Pierre had healed his knee enough that he was able to stand, and he had an amused grin on his face as he watched Fiorucci. Sadly his eyesight was blurry from the concentration of magic, and what should be a pitiful sight instead became reminiscent to Arnold Schwarzenegger in the opening scene of Terminator. "You continue to impress me, human of the pillars. Yet your might proves your undoing," Pierre said. Then he disappeared. Hecadoth excited Fiorucci's body, looking unsettled as the lieutenant clutched his jewels. "Are you all right? Do I look all right?" Fiorucci replied heatedly, shimming on the ground in a vain attempt to ward off the pain. "Stuff like this never happens to Oga, so why is it so natural in my fight scenes? Aren't I the protagonist? Shouldn't I be looking cool instead?" Rather than, Hecadoth's sweat dropped, "Would you rather not check up on the girls?" That magician's last words were disconcerting. Fiorucci's eyes lit up and he nodded in understanding. Right, of course, the girls. It took a while, but before long Fiorucci was awkwardly waddling towards his apartment with Hecadoth trailing behind, a stony look on his face as he did. When Fiorucci returned home, it was to less than ideal circumstances. "Fiorucci!" Lamia exclaimed as he passed through the door. Fiorucci was immediately on guard and he glanced around the room warily. Lamia looked tired and worn, while Zenobia was sitting on the couch, gnawing at her bottom lip in apparent anxiousness as she stared at Anoka's bedroom. He instantly knew what was wrong. "Anoka?" Fiorucci asked, even as Hecadoth perked up to the situation. Lamia blinked but immediately got down to business, her face strong and eyes sympathetic. "She's been dealt a harsh blow," Lamia stated. "It wouldn't be okay for you to see her right now." Fiorucci frowned, staring at her intensely, before heading straight for the room in question. Lamia didn't stop him, neither did Zenobia, and he didn't quite know how to take their inaction. When he entered the room, it was dark, and Anoka was sitting on her bed, legs up to her chest, and shivering. "Anoka?" Fiorucci asked. "Nisan?" Anoka asked, perking up at the sound of his voice. Fiorucci turned on the lights and tried to smile reassuringly at her, keeping his punctured arm behind his back while he did. The effects wasn't what he was expecting. When her eyes caught sight of Fiorucci, they widened to incomprehensible proportions, and she raised her arms defensively in front of her face. She screamed, loudly, and yelled furiously. "Get away! Get away! Get away!" Over and over again. Fiorucci was frozen, not knowing what to do, and it was only due to Lamia arriving and pulling him out of the room that stopped Anoka from shouting. "Anoka! Calm down, it's me, Lamia. You're fine. Kokabeel isn't anywhere nearby. But Anoka didn't respond, and Lamia sighed as she turned off the lights again. Try and get some sleep, Anoka, I'll leave the lights off, okay? She waited for a response again, but when nothing came, she left the room without another word. Outside, Fiorucci was utterly confused and lost. What happened? What was that? I mean, I know she doesn't see me in the brightest light, but she was screaming as though I was the boogeyman. Fiorucci glanced down at Lamia, and saw her hesitating with her answer. Well, you see, she struggled. It was a spell, Zenobia stated in her place, one that affected Anoka's mind. How? Fiorucci asked. I was battling Pierre, there was no way he could have done it. Pierre? Lamia asked, but then shook her head. Never mind. The person who did this was of a high level. While you were out in your fight, he used an image of you in Anoka's mind to create a falsified memory. It was an attack aimed directly at Anoka to get to you. Why? Fiorucci yelled. Try and understand, Fiorucci, Hekadoth stated, using Fiorucci's name. You represent an unknown in their plans. In fact, you are currently a big problem. Usually you would mean nothing, but since the current Maos have the Red Dragon Emperor and other sacred gear users at his disposal for the peace meeting, adding you on top of that, with you mutated and abnormal sacred gear, it would give them an unprecedented wrench in their plans. This is a statement, Zenobia stated, completely oblivious to Hekadoth's words, to show that they could strike at any time and wherever they want. Fiorucci snorted, that doesn't mean much when I beat the pulp out of the guy that attacked me. However, Hekadoth made a sound of disagreement. That's not it, Fiorucci. That guy that attacked us was good, but at the level this magic was done, this was done by someone with more ability than them. You heard Pierre's last words. He was there to gather information on your capabilities, which meant his ability to defeat you was irrelevant. You can be sure that the next time you fight them, they would be prepared for you. Fiorucci frowned, letting the words sink in, before turning to Lamia. What exactly happened to Lamia? And what was that all about with Kokabeel? Lamia furrowed her brow, and assumed a thinking pose. Anoka's memory of her time with Kokabeel was not erased, rather, it was buried, yes? At Fiorucci's nod of confirmation she continued on. Now psychologically speaking, Anoka would have been able to go on with life fine if she didn't come across any trigger to resurface those memories. What these magicians did, however, was the opposite. Rather than resurface the buried memories, they reimagined it. Wait, how would you do that? I thought even you guys couldn't get that complicated with your magic, Fiorucci interjected. Strictly speaking, we can't, at least not with a time constraint, but Anoka has a factor that helps in the process. Her repressed memories? Zenobia asked. Lamia nodded her head. Rather than create something from nothing, they replaced a key part of an existing memory with another thing. Now, while this is possible, certain conditions must be met. First and foremost, the thing being replaced and the thing that is taking its place must be able to fill the space left behind. For instance, when Kokabeel attacked us, he displayed some power. Fiorucci, when you were attacked by Anoka, you must have leaked some demonic energy of some sort. Or perhaps, during your battle, they were able to transfer the image of you fighting to her somehow, but that's speculation. Anyway, due to your demonic energy, you were able to fill out the overall shape of the Kokabeel in her memory, that being your unnatural pressure caused by your energy. Secondly, the overall feeling of the person. This, while not as important, is still a defining characteristic. It depends on Anoka's perception of the world, and if you, in that brief time that was used to falsify her memory, had caused her to perceive you the same way she perceived Kokabeel, you would have been able to take the place of the fallen angel in the memory. Lastly, how traumatic the event is. The more traumatic the event, the more vivid the details and the effect is greater. Because the memory was so strong, and it impacted her greatly, the SWCH in details was lost to the overall emotion and severity of the memory that she never noticed the discrepancy in what should be false and what should be true. So you're saying Anoka thinks I'm Kokabeel? Fiorucci asked in stunned disbelief. Yes, I am, Lamia stated. I can cure her, if I can take her back to the fort. Remember when you first visited the fort, and had to enter the memory of that assassin to regain his memories and lose his amnesia? It applies here, except, we're re-establishing her connection to the correct memory, Furuichi frowned. Then I'll go immediately. No. Lamia stated, you're needed here, and the fort cannot be prepared for something like this when the old malfaction is running about because of the meeting. We'll have to wait until the end of the meeting before we can properly set up the whole thing so that absolutely nothing hurts Anoka in the process. She accentuated the last part when it looked like Furuichi was about to interrupt her. The best option for her right now is to wait until we can safely perform the operation on her. Until then we'll have to watch over her. But my parents will come tomorrow. What am I supposed to tell them? I can't just, wait a minute. Furuichi stopped his sentence and stared at Anoka quizzically. Lamia blinked, staring at him in confusion as he gave her a once-over. She became self-conscious, and crossed her arms as she blushed. What is it? Furuichi didn't answer and instead raced into his room. He then returned, with a brown wig, and placed it onto Lamia's head. The pinkette sweat dropped as he began fixing the wig and stepped back to admire his handiwork. It's a good thing you grepped to Anoka's height, Furuichi muttered and showed her a mirror. Lamia did not look like Anoka at all, in fact the brown hair didn't suit her face, but thanks to her height it could be overlooked. Lamia could understand what Furuichi was doing, and while she had a lot of inhibitions with it, she at least understood in him trying something. However, why did you have a wig in your room? Lamia asked with an eye twitch. Obviously he came prepared for any situation, Zenobia stated, nodding to herself in assuredness. I grow ever curious in the situation you find yourself in, Lieutenant, Kirin muttered sarcastically as he listened to Furuichi's report. In his defense, it wasn't like he had asked for this situation to come. It was completely off the walls even for him, and it hurt to think that his little sister had been exploited in some fashion. Though it makes me curious as to what exactly our enemies hope to achieve by driving your sister insane. To divide our attention? Or perhaps some other machinations are at play? Furuichi's sweat dropped as Kirin began to think deeply on the situation. He was back at school, with Zenobia standing by his side waiting by the gate as Furuichi discussed the situation with Kirin and Aleem. You understand, right? Because of the situation, I would greatly appreciate it if one of you two were to watch over Anoka while I deal with the school day. Kirin glanced at Aleem. This is so troublesome, Aleem pouted, why do I have to do it? In desperation, Furuichi clapped his hands in front of him and bowed his head. Please, I'll pull your share of the work so watch over my sister for me, okay? The young demon huffed and nodded her head sullenly as she kicked the wall. Furuichi sighed in wariness as his worries were slightly lifted from that. A hand grasped his shoulder, and he looked over his shoulder to see Zenobia smiling reassuringly at Furuichi. You are doing well under pressure, Furuichi, she said. She was trying to comfort Furuichi in her own special way. That's very cute and endearing, Zenobia, but complimenting him when his sister was half insane was not the way to go about it. Quick thinking like that is oft to save lives. Your sister is in good hands, Furuichi. Trust in yourself. The young boy sighed and glanced down at his hand where the king's crest lied. Furuichi frowned, and nodded. This was no moment to falter, Furuichi decided, he'll make the best of the situation. Kirin, with the blatant attack in the day, we would need to redouble our efforts in searching for the enemy. No doubt, Kirin agreed, the statement they gave was loud and clear, and leaving it unchecked would spell doom on us. Furuichi nodded and blinked his eyes as Aleem disappeared in a spray of magic, concealing the spectacle with a simple spell. Kirin went off on his assigned patrol route while both Zenobia and Furuichi watched him go. Was it wise to speak of your plan out in the open? Zenobia asked. Furuichi understood what she meant by that, but couldn't help but smile slightly at his calm and determined expression. She reminded him of Kaneda for a bit, except with less of the real-world knowledge needed to appear sane. It doesn't matter. They've already practically broadcasted to us that they're watching us every step of the way. Pierre was just there to get information, and they obviously sent him because he was the only one who could fight with me on even terms. That means anybody else would be either too weak or too strong, and blatantly attacking me with number or power puts risk on whatever their plan is to disrupt the peace talks, Fiorucci explained. These words that fell out of his mouth sounded so natural in his voice. It honestly worried Fiorucci, making it seem as though he was turning native. That was the furthest thing he wanted, to become accustomed to danger and politicking. He had no idea what he wanted to do in life, but it sure as hell wasn't being a soldier or a politician. Actually, now that he thought about it, Fiorucci never did have any thoughts on his future. Never anything beyond staying by Oga's side. Realizing that now, he immediately sweat-dropped as he envisioned himself in a high-security prison alongside Oga. Perhaps a little more thoughts on his future career should be first on his priorities after all of this was finished and he returned to Ishiyama. If he returned at all. I see, Zenobia stated, I'll be on my way then. She, in a surprising move, stepped towards him and hugged his arm. Her face was eyeing him mechanically, and Fiorucci just knew she was contemplating the effect of kissing him. Finally she shook her head, not time yet, she asked herself, doesn't feel like it. Then she broke off and said, see you later, Takayuki-kun. Fiorucci blushed and scratched his cheek, the casual use of his personal name still flustering him. He waved at Zenobia as she disappeared into the school building, and sighed as he turned around to look at his last obstacle for the day. Hiding behind a lamp post, staring at the ground with a deep scarlet blush on her face, Lamia was trying her best to disappear from the world as she fiddled with the Kuo Academy uniform. With some makeup, actually a lot of makeup, and some very hefty soles in her shoes, Lamia was almost the same height and skin color as Anoka. She was still a bit slim though, and her face was different to Anoka. Lamia told him she had taken a pill that altered her appearance, but Fiorucci couldn't see it. Maybe it had to do with his new powers. Lamia, how long are you planning on hiding there? He asked. For as long as it takes for an asteroid to come and obliterate us all, she stated with an annoyed huff. Why do I have to do this anyway? Why not just say that Anoka is sick? Because my mom and dad are coming, and if they heard that then they would go to check on Anoka, Fiorucci answered. So even if you don't dress up as Anoka and go to school, you'll have to dress like Anoka and pretend to be sick, under the same roof as the real sick Anoka. Lamia pursed her lips, staring at Fiorucci defiantly. You've gotten better at arguments, she accused. Fiorucci snorted. I have. Lunch with Hekadoth every other Thursday, so that's to be expected. Lamia made an angry hump sound. What about you? Won't your parents want to check on you? I don't have to go. Fiorucci paused, and carefully chose his words. No, Lamia, you really do. I'm a big boy, and mom and dad don't have to watch over me and see me study. Anoka on the other hand. She's their daughter, and she's their pride and joy. They will want to see her more than me. You say that as though you're a statistic, she said exasperatedly. Fiorucci smiled bitterly, no, but I'm not exactly the family favorite. Between me and Anoka, that title goes to her every other day. Lamia paused, glancing up at Fiorucci with a cryptic face. Fiorucci frowned, deciding that maybe he was talking a little too much, and patted Lamia on the head. You and Anoka are practically like the same person anyway, Fiorucci stated, both of you are sarcastic, annoying, spitfires when you want to be. Lamia huffed, and Fiorucci smiled. He waved his hand towards the school. Come on, the parents will arrive by 3rd PRD. So you best get prepared. Lamia nodded her head sullenly, resigned to her fate at Fiorucci's suggestion, and moved towards the academy with purposeful steps. Fiorucci watched her go, and felt the edges of his lips curl upwards as she didn't try to appear meek for a second. Instead, Her shoulders were held straight and back, with her spine straight and her chin leveled with the ground. It wasn't a cutesy walk, nor was it the walk of a girl walking into a place she felt uncomfortable with. It was the walk of a girl confident in herself and her abilities, and would not allow the world to see her as nothing but the accomplished young woman that she was. Lamia had certainly grown, Fiorucci decided, and he lamented these feelings of pride, emotion. Congratulations. Fiorucci meant what he said a year ago, when he said that Lamia looked more like a woman now. She wasn't exactly young anymore, and by human terms she was close to Onoka's actual age. Stay strong, Fiorucci muttered in good luck, and rubbed his finger over the serpent guard pin on his uniform. With a final sigh, Fiorucci glanced at the surrounding streets, wary of watchers, and headed into the school. He walked into the school building, feeling greatly at home at the silent halls and wide empty space. He flexed his fingers and felt the tonfas under his sleeves rest snugly inside their sheaths. Now that he had access to Kirin's soul again, the tonfas felt were now a calming presence on Fiorucci's person. The souls in his keeping hummed thoughtfully, all of them behaving as they should and not conflicting with each other. Actually, now that he thought about it, Fiorucci had never tried to access any other part of his soul beyond Kirin's. It stood to reason that, if he had inherited the skills and abilities of Kirin, albeit not quite fully, then he would have gained some as well from the rest. Thinking about it, Fiorucci now had an accumulated lifespan of at least 200 to maybe 300 years, give or take a decade thanks to his use of his balance breaker. But even then that number was contested. These weren't full souls of supernatural beings, rather part of them, all mishmoshed onto him. It was completely foreign, never having happened before. He may have the added lifespan of each individual supernatural entity, or halves of each one. The only thing he could draw back on was his rate of cellular decay, and he didn't know nearly enough medical know-how to understand Dr. Fracas and Lamia explaining it to him. Knowing this, it could also stand to reason that since Fiorucci had never fully absorbed an actual supernatural entity to gain these traits, they could very well be blank slates just mimicking other supernatural beings. Having no actual memories to share with Fiorucci, he decided he'd check for himself. With a smart-about face, he made his way towards the bathroom, and eyed his reflection on the other side. He still had his silver hair, his boyish-looking face, and unassuming posture beneath the uniform. But there was now an added edge to his jawline, a wrinkle in his eyebrow, a squareness to his shoulders, that seemed alien on Fiorucci. Alien to the Fiorucci that originally never had a reason to be in the occult beyond supporting Oga. With a sigh, Fiorucci delved into his soul. If Fiorucci had to give a rough estimate to the size of his soul, he would say it was as large as a monument the Egyptians would make for their kings. It was tall, with a near-endless surface area to make way for these new bits stitched on. The supernatural parts of his soul were all jumbled up away from each other. Some were close together, appearing to Fiorucci as allies in their new world, while others stood isolated, daring anyone to come near them. It looked like staring at the world map, except he had traveled back in time to the Cold War. The souls on Fiorucci's body, more or less, had been put there for a purpose. The water spirit and dryad were to heal and mend Fiorucci's body from the fight with Kokobile and to possibly deal with any damage to his body on a cellular level caused by the fractured image. The vampire gave him better capacity to hold demonic energy. The fae, the fairies, the fair folk, the winged divines acted as a conduit, a mediator between Fiorucci and the other parts of his body. Like legends, the fae essentially became queen, an authority that could not be challenged, and was making sure the more powerful souls did not devour Fiorucci's body. The yokai, of many different types, acted as a spiritual connection for Fiorucci and the natural ley lines to feed his new guest souls. Finally was the werewolf, and Forca's only explanation was that it was there to ease any more future physical transformations Fiorucci may suffer in the future. With a small sigh, he went and located Kirin's soul. It was a deep scarlet patch, beating furiously at a fast pace as though it was a heart being overdosed with adrenaline, and Fiorucci began accessing its memories. He gained the knowledge needed to wield the tonfas at a new advanced level, but would still be imitative to Kirin's actual style. Slowly, to unlock more information, he began pulling on the soul, spreading it across his soul, and like last time the vampire part reacted. Like on a crusade it screamed, its dark foggy black appearance raging like a tsunami, and the water spirit side washed its cool surface over the vampire, trying to quell it. Frowning Fiorucci stopped pulling it and allowed the piece of soul to return to its original state. This time Fiorucci tried something different. Rather than pulling the piece of soul to fuse with his soul, he pulled his human soul over the demon soul. Fusing and overlapping the demon soul, so rather than having the demon part overtake his human part overtook the demon part. His finger twitched, but no new information on skill seemed to take hold on his person. No new knowledge took place, and Fiorucci sighed in disappointment. He opened his eyes, and promptly gasped in slight wonder at his eyesight. Specifically, how his eyesight now resembled the time when Fiorucci activated Shattered Mirror and took Kirin in. These were the eyes that Kairing saw the world in. And Fiorucci gulped as a near-twisted form was reflected back at Fiorucci from the mirror. He released his effect on his soul and allowed it to return to where it was. He then focused on the vampire part. He tried to unlock any knowledge he could gather from it. But the only new information he got from the soul was information on two families, the Camilla and Teeps families, and nothing else. No new martial arts style or anything of the like. But, there was a new sensation that spread throughout him. Superiority. It whispered at the back of his head. Like a bad tune, it lingered in his mind and twisted the crank over and over again. A strange feeling of pride and arrogance seemed to take over, and Fiorucci let go immediately, reverting back to normal. It seemed whoever the soul was, or if it was merely a stereotype of vampires, he or she must have been one hell of a prick. He did the same thing he did moments ago and spread his soul over the vampire. He was initially surprised by it trying to resist. Blasphemy, the word repeated in his head. Unclean, and other derogatory words were yelled before it managed to calm down enough to accept its fate. All at once Fiorucci was suddenly hit with a bout of dizziness, and he placed his hands on the water basin as he steadied himself. Finally he opened his eyes and blinked at his new image. His skin hadn't suddenly turned pale, heaven have mercy for that, but his eyes had changed color to a deep red. His upper canines had elongated a few millimeters, and some of his senses were enhanced. He blinked at his mirror image and was surprised to see that it was strangely foggy and translucent. Fiorucci recalled that vampires did not have reflections, and it seemed that since Fiorucci wasn't fully a vampire, his reflection was only partially gone. It was an interesting tidbit, one he wondered if he could pull on Oga. Thinking about it, he probably would react with nary a change in expression, and the red tails would probably have a teasing remark here and there. He stopped, and listened to the shuffling of feet outside, and judging from the deepness of their voices, most of them were adults. The parents must have arrived then. Fiorucci stepped out from the bathroom, mildly aware he had stayed in there for the entirety of first PRD, and noticed the parents now entering their children's classes. Go Asia. Go. Blinking, Fiorucci passed Zenobia, Issei, and Asia's classroom to see a wildly cheering pair of parents spurring on Asia. Strange, as from what he could tell they were Asian while Asia was clearly foreign. Tracking his eyes he spotted Issei staring at them, a completely disbelieving and stunned expression on his face. Fiorucci sweat dropped when he realized why, and zoomed in on the parents' name tags to see they were from the Hayadu household. Poor Issei. Though to be frank, if Fiorucci had Asia as a little sister he'd probably not give a SHT about anyone else too. He spied Zenobia from the corner of his eye, twiddling with her PVC clay, and he noticed she was concentrating extra HRD on it. It must be difficult for her, Fiorucci thought, knowing that she was surrounded by so many loving parents but having no one do the same for her. She paused from her knitting and looked up at Fiorucci in surprise. She must have noticed his eyes on her. Fiorucci didn't know what to do, so he nodded at her, trying to look cool in his cuffed-up military uniform. She blinked, and it seemed she felt more comfortable with that rigid response than a friendly wave. She nodded rigidly back at him but stopped short at the second nod, and then pulled her hand up to wave. There was a smile on her face, a bright light in her eyes, and Fiorucci realized she must have been happy to think that he had came by to see her. There was a cough sound and he felt his face go rigid when the sight of the teacher, slightly annoyed with a knowing Rizzy in his eyebrow, appeared in his vision. Sorry, Fiorucci lamented and sent one last beaming smile at Zenobia, which was slightly forced and unnatural but seemingly no less welcomed, before turning around and walking away. He stuffed his hands in his pocket and walked along. With a start he could feel a high amount of demonic energy enter the school premises. He knew that Lucifer-sama and Gremory-sama had entered the school building. His ability to detect demonic energy had risen up exponentially over the past few days, and he was beginning to be able to discern classes from the volume of demonic energy in the air. Finally another large volume of energy entered, and Fiorucci could confirm that Leviathan-sama had entered the premises. Fiorucci reviewed the process of the day. Sonakaishu and Kirin would be escorting the Gremory family around the school, while the rest of the student council would be handling the day-to-day problems to ensure the school was fine. He stepped down to the first floor and made his way to the first-year building. Some of them were out of their classes, art classes primarily, and Fiorucci noticed Lamia in the crowd. "You're so good, Anoka," he heard his mother say and watched as his family interacted with Lamia. The disguised Pinkette blushed at his mother's praise and squirmed uncomfortably between both his parents. "You could sell this for a lot of money. You might get a position at an art gallery or something like that with this," his father stated exuberantly. Lamia seemed to come to life at the praise, and Fiorucci smiled slightly at the nice scene. It was good that Lamia was getting along well with his parents, he decided. Lamia seemed to notice him and shot him a mild glare that he was there. The blush on her face showed that she was slightly embarrassed that he was there, and Fiorucci couldn't help the wide smile and chuckle that came out when he saw that. "Ah, you're letting your tsun side out, Lamia," he thought amusedly. As he walked he passed by one of the student council members, the vice president if he remembered right, and they both exchanged curt nods. It was a strange feeling. Back in Ishiyama and Saint Ishiyama, Fiorucci never had a level of responsibility as this, nor was he so involved with those who did. He felt a class rep, or a member of the student council, watching the school and the people. Somehow Fiorucci managed to step out into the back of the school, where the trees and bushes of the natural ground bordered the school grounds. He frowned, just as a gush of familiar energy sparks nearby. Just a small drizzle, and Fiorucci managed to attach a face to it. "I see you're doing well," a voice said. Fiorucci turned to the person who spoke and nodded rigidly at Pierre. He tensed his muscles, open suspicion and wariness on his face as he flexed his wrist. "What are you doing here?" In another time Fiorucci would have jumped in the air, pointing and yelling, and maybe be seen as a fool. But not now, because Pierre didn't see him as a fool, and with Oga not there, or in fact no one being there, Fiorucci only had the comfort of his own fear and confidence to protect him. "I wouldn't think that you would try and blow your chances before the meeting." Pierre smiled lopsidedly, and shook his head. "Not now," he said, "I'm not here on roll. I did my job last night, and I'm not here because those stingy scruffs in the Cows Brigade are flipping coin my way." He pulled off the tree and walked towards Fiorucci. The lieutenant had spent a long time around unassuming strong guys to know better than to take him lightly. "How did no one else figure out you were here?" Fiorucci asked. Pierre smiled and pulled up his sleeve, revealing a myriad of tattoos on his person spiraling up and towards his body. "I'm warded," he said matter-of-factly. He pulled down his sleeve but winced for a moment as he moved a little bit too fast. Fiorucci smirked, slightly prideful at the damage he had done to the more experienced fighter the other night. "Of course I'm sure everyone else felt me the moment I let it go to reveal myself to you." Though I take it since I haven't been redexed to paste, they're ignoring me. What do you want? Pierre let go of his smile and crossed his arms. Just to talk. The Cows Brigade paid me coin to beat you around to get a grasp of our abilities, instead I got tossed about. Thanks for that, I managed to wrangle a compensation fee. He flashed a grin at Fiorucci, whose face had soured when he heard that. Of course, even I have now piqued an interest with you. You're not normal for a vessel, not even in the slightest bit. I take it is because you spend so long around the son of the Beelzebub, and that had exponentially increased your growth. Those red tails, punks, and the like have all garnered interesting abilities thanks in part to their relation with him. Pierre's smile seemed to have grown when he realized that Fiorucci's guarded face had become even more so now that he had pulled up information he should not have. More surprising things you learned by asking around. Oh, brilliant! Pierre exclaimed, smart boy. Here I thought we were a dying breed. Too many people mistake memorization as actual smartness these days. Fiorucci frowned but couldn't help but ask, what do you mean by me not being normal for a vessel? Another smile. Simply put, any other vessel would have imploded long before they unlocked their balance breaker. You didn't, and you unlocked balance breaker. Only very few have ever come close to doing that. You are an enigma. I can bet that even your Maos are scratching their heads and wondering what to do with you. Yu Huan had come into contact with a member of the old Mao family, the new Mao, and having been drenched in a constant flow of demonic energy. I may have hung up my robes, but I am intrigued in your growth. Now this is a lot of information for merely asking around. Fiorucci mentioned guardedly. Undoubtedly, Pierre remarked dryly. I'll have to make a run for it soon. If you want to know more about your own situation, then I suggest you ask Michael. If there was anyone else out there who knows more about this, I'll be surprised. Or perhaps Azazel wouldn't mind giving you a little something. With those parting words, Pierre disappeared behind the shadows of the trees. Fiorucci couldn't quite guess how he had managed that but decided that didn't matter at all. Fiorucci discarded everything Pierre told him and only focused on the here and now. If there was ever a time where he could clarify his position, in this world and in the underworld, Fiorucci would see to it then and there. His head was aching trying to keep up as it is. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 5. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author WD0345 on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.